Are you ready, babe? Sheila asked. Without waiting for me to reply, she carefully lowered herself to tease me. God, I've missed this, she smiled down at me. But just as she began to pick up the pace, I heard a strange banging noise in the back of my mind. Sheila's smile turned into a mocking laugh as her vision began to fade from my mind. I was almost fully awake now. The dream, or nightmare, as it always turned into, was gone. I realized the noise was someone banging on my front door. Struggling out of bed, I grabbed my robe and made my way towards the door of my flat. Mr. Sleeman, open up. It's the police, I heard a voice demand as I got closer to the door. Upon opening the door, I was confronted by 4 men, 2 of whom were in police uniforms. One of the men in plain clothes, whom I didn't recognize, stepped forward. Martin Sleeman, I'm Detective Sergeant Moon, he said, flashing his warrant card at me. Can we come in? I'd like a word with you, if I may. I had seen enough warrant cards in my life to know it was genuine at first glance, but having grown up on what some folks would consider the wrong side of town, I asked for a better look at his card, just to irritate him. Look, I didn't know what these people wanted, but I hadn't done anything I needed to worry about. Okay, what is this all about? I asked as I switched the kettle on after leading them into the kitchen. If you don't mind, I'll ask the questions, DS Moon replied. In that case, I won't answer any questions until my solicitor is present. Have you got something to hide, Mr. Sleeman? He demanded. Alarm bells really started going off in my head. To be honest, I'd known D.C. Douglas Collins, the other officer, for years. He knew my name was Marty to everyone. The Mr. Sleeman bit spelled trouble, big time. No, but I feel slightly outnumbered here. If you want to ask me questions, I want to know in what context you're asking them. It's not often that I get woken up at, I looked at the clock. It's 5 o'clock. What the hell's so important that you've got to wake me at this time of the morning? I'm making inquiries concerning your wife's accident. What accident? Your wife was involved in an accident last night, and I would like to know where you were around 11 p.m. I was here alone, as I am most evenings nowadays. Is my ex-wife badly hurt? She's in intensive care, but the doctors tell me that the prognosis is reasonable. Now, would you be so kind as to tell me where we can find your Range Rover? Do you suspect I had something to do with my ex-wife's accident? Mrs. Sleeman and a Mr. Anthony Pride were walking down Finchley Road at approximately 11 o'clock last evening. A Range Rover, traveling quite fast, mounted the pavement and drove straight at them. The car hit your ex-wife but missed Mr. Pride. He claims it was a deliberate attempt to kill both of them. The Range Rover drove off without stopping. Now, I would like to take a close look at your Range Rover, please. You'll have to wait a couple of hours yet. Bessie's in Roland's garage, having the gearbox replaced again. She's been in there all week. DS Moon looked at the 2 uniformed officers, and they left, presumably to visit Roland. Is there any way you can prove that you were here last night, Mr. Sleeman? That's a good one. How the hell am I expected to prove that I was alone in my flat? The definition of being alone means that I had no one here to vouch for me, doesn't it? Well, in that case, I'm going to ask you to come down to the station and help me with my inquiries. Sure, but you won't mind if I call my solicitor first and then get dressed, will you? I called my solicitor, who wasn't pleased to be woken at that time of the morning, and then I got dressed. As we left the flat, I noticed Mrs. Cummings, our local Nosy Parker, watching us through her kitchen window. Since her husband passed away some years ago, Mrs. Cummings had little else to do but watch the comings and goings of her neighbors. I turned to Doug Collins. If you have a word with the old witch in there, she'll probably give you a detailed list of my movements all week. Nothing gets past her, no matter what time of night. DC Collins and DS Moon exchanged glances, then Collins walked back and knocked on the old girl's door. DS Moon and I continued down to their car. After sitting there for some time, D.C. Collins appeared out of the block of flats, and Mooney went over to meet him. They had an animated conversation for a few moments, then D.C. Collins came over to me. To be fair, Doug Collins wasn't really a bad bloke. At school, we got on quite well together, but we've had a couple of run-ins since he took up his chosen profession. The old girl says there's no way you left your flat between 8 o'clock when you got home and 2 o'clock in the morning when she went to bed. Does the old girl stay up until all the neighbors are in bed? I don't know, but she likes her bit of gossip. I suppose you heard about the woman in number 22. The old witch reckons she's up to something while her husband is at sea. Yeah, I got chapter and verse on that one. Anyway, the Sarge reckons what the old girl says puts you right out of the frame. Mind you, he's still going to take a good look at your car. That's his prerogative, but he won't find anything. Anyway, what hospital is Sheila in? I'd like to check up on her. The Royal. I'm afraid she's in a bad way, Marty. She's in the ICU, and they're not sure if she'll pull through. You realize we have to treat it as serious until we know for sure which way the cookie crumbles. And with that last debacle between you and Sheila, we have little option but to investigate your whereabouts. Don't worry, I understand. You've got a job to do. Right now, I'm going back up to have a shave, then I'm heading down there. Marty, you're still hung up on that woman, aren't you? What do you think, Doug? You've known us long enough. But she left you for that slimy Tony Pride, didn't she? To be honest with you, Doug, I'm not sure what happened at first, but you know me. Once I got out of my pram, I wouldn't listen to any explanations and blew my top. I thought she divorced you. She did, but she didn't have much choice. I was climbing the walls and threatening to kill her and Pridey. I suppose that's what sent your DS chasing around here so quickly. Not really. It was Pridey who pointed the finger at you. Look, I think we need to have a word off the books about all this later on if you don't mind. I'll be in the Plough about 6-ish. I tend to eat there as soon as the kitchen opens. I'll try to make it there tonight. I'd better go now. The Sarge is getting impatient. He hasn't had his breakfast yet. Oh, what was his plan? Let me sweat it out in a cell while he had his breakfast. Not far off. But as you hadn't been charged, he'd probably leave you waiting in an interview room for an hour or so. I watched the officers drive away and then went back up to my flat to call my solicitor and let him know he wouldn't be required at the station. Then I prepared myself for my visit to the hospital. Sheila and I had met in a bar about 12 years ago. The guy she'd been with was one of those who, when they get a few drinks in them, think they're the king of the world and look for a scrap. But he picked a fight with the wrong guy, someone quite small, who I suppose he thought he could handle easily. He might have been half-cut, but he wasn't that stupid. His trouble was he picked on a guy whose brothers were in the other bar. It might have been very messy if the governor hadn't been quick off the mark and got the police to turn up. Anyway, after her date was hauled off to the Nick by the local constabulary, I, being the gentleman that I am, offered Sheila the benefit of my protection and a lift home. Well, we never actually went straight home. We stopped in another pub for a quiet drink to calm Sheila's nerves down a bit. From there, we dated steadily for several months until she went off to university. It was 4 years later, and I was playing best man at a friend's wedding. Who should turn up as a bridesmaid but Sheila? Now, everyone knows that the best man is supposed to look after the bridesmaid, so the next thing you know, Sheila and I wake up in the morning in the same bed. Damn that I had been too drunk to remember our first night together, although I do remember being with one of the other bridesmaids earlier in the evening. Sheila must have played hard to get at first. I think she expected me to wait for her while she was at university, but as I'd heard she was playing the field up there, I had no intention of being played for a fool. Anyway, let's cut to the chase. Sheila and I were married 6 months later when she was 4 months pregnant. I think we were very happy together. I'll say I because you can never really tell what other folks are thinking, can you? All you can ever be certain of are the feelings in your own heart. Unfortunately, we lost our little Kathy at 3 months. Sudden infant death syndrome, they said. That's just their way of saying, we don't know why your baby died. The trouble with that one is there are always folks who will make up their own minds about what happened and gossip behind your back. Sheila's cycle went off track after little Kathy went. We tried really hard for the next few years, but Sheila just didn't fall pregnant again. The doctor put her on the pill to regulate her cycle, but that, of course, didn't do much for our baby-making plans. She could, however, hold down a job after she was on the pill, something she'd had a lot of trouble with over the years. PMS is only supposed to last for a couple of days. When Sheila's cycle was disrupted, hers could last for a couple of weeks at a time. Things were happier at home as well. With her cycle going haywire, home life hadn't been too pleasant on occasion. Well, things settled down for about 3 years, then the subject of children came up again. We figured that the pill might have sorted out Sheila's cycle problem, and if she came off it, with luck, things should return to normal. Best laid plans of mice and men. Sheila's periods now came at regular intervals, but we still didn't get lucky in the child stakes. Still, these things can take time. Then one afternoon, I came home from work, and Sheila wasn't home yet. She was always home before me. I started getting dinner ready. Well, I tried, but I'm not much cop at cooking. After wandering around the kitchen like a lost sheep for half an hour or so, I resorted to the old standby and called the local Chinese to have a takeaway delivered. By 7 o'clock, the Chinese had arrived, but there was still no sign of Sheila. I've got to say, by now, I was getting very worried. After all, you read some strange stories in the newspapers nowadays. I called her office, but the security guard said they had all left hours ago. I started calling her friends from work. Luckily, we had one of those personal phone books by the phone, and Sheila had written everybody's number in it. I couldn't get an answer from any of her workmates, so from that, I assumed she must have stopped for a drink with them after work. But by now, it was gone 9 o'clock. Well, it was 1:30 when the taxi pulled up outside, and a very noisy Sheila staggered out, shouting goodnight to her friends. I took up a superior stance, sitting in the kitchen awaiting her arrival. I think I should point out here that we tended to use the kitchen door as the main entrance. It's just the way that house was laid out when they converted it from a barn, it was the nearest door to the road. Maybe I overdid the look of disdain I had on my face. I'm not sure, but when Sheila walked in the door, she took one look at me and then, before I could really get into playing the annoyed husband, she just said, "Forget you. I've got a right to go out for a drink with my friends now and again." Then she turned, I assume with the intention of going through the door that led to the hall and the stairs to the bedroom. Unfortunately, Sheila opened the door to the basement instead and then promptly went head over heels down the stairs. As quickly as I tried to be, I wasn't able to get there in time. When I saw Sheila turning the wrong way, did I shout a warning to her? I really couldn't remember. I just saw her disappearing through the cellar door. The ambulance arrived surprisingly quickly, and Sheila was hauled off to the hospital. Luckily, Sheila hadn't broken any bones. The doctor said that was most likely because she was drunk, something to do with the body being relaxed. But she had taken a nasty bump on the head, and she was suffering from a concussion, so they kept her in for observation. What I couldn't understand was her attitude toward me that night. But then I didn't like what one of the doctors said to me. He asked if Sheila and I were in the habit of taking recreational drugs. I told him there was no way either of us took any drugs. He just raised his eyebrows and went to turn away. Look, I've never been one to hold my tongue, so I asked him to elaborate on why he'd asked the question, but he wouldn't. The following day, when I went to visit Sheila in the hospital, quite late, as I had been up most of the night, Detective Constable Douglas Collins was coming out of her room as I arrived. He just said hi to me and kept on walking past. When I asked Sheila what he was doing there, she said he was investigating her accident, but Sheila apparently had no recollection of the previous day at all. That evening, after I arrived home, D.C. Collins came to call. I had to give him chapter and verse of the previous day's events. He took a good look around the kitchen and at the basement stairs. I had to show him where I had been sitting. I pointed out the security monitor that I had watched Sheila arrive home on. Then I found and played him the part of the video that showed Sheila arriving home so he could see and hear her getting out of the taxi and staggering towards the house. After that, he did what I thought was a strange thing. He asked me to go outside the door and shout. I never could understand the point of that, but it did give him a little time alone in the house. After he asked me to come back inside, he requested that I play the video of Sheila coming home again, only this time he asked me to let it run on a little longer. I was surprised that you could not only hear me shouting to Sheila that she was going through the wrong door but also her scream as she fell as well. He left apparently satisfied that it had been an accident, but he steadfastly refused to tell me why he thought it was anything else. It was the next day when I visited Sheila in the hospital that I first clapped eyes on Tony Pride. As I walked along the corridor, several of her friends from work were coming away from her room. Later, I was to find out that one of them was Tony Pride. When I entered her room, Sheila told me the doctor had told her she could go home, but she was to take things easy for a while. I helped her dress and then drove her home. Of course, I wanted to know why she hadn't contacted me to let me know she was going out with her friends, but she claimed she had no recollection of the day of the accident at all, so she couldn't tell me. What I was really upset about was her attitude when she got home that night. I had never stopped her from going out with her friends, just as she didn't object when I went for a drink with the guys. However, we always let each other know what was going on so that we wouldn't worry. For the next few months, things appeared to go on as normal, but I noticed that there was a greater distance between us than usual. To be honest, things had never been completely normal. Sheila's strange PMS symptoms, as I mentioned, lasted longer than most people's, and her cycle was slowly getting all messed up again. But this time, things were definitely different, although I couldn't put my finger on what was causing the problem. It would have been easy to blame the PMS, but I wasn't convinced. Sheila was spending more evenings with her friends and was treating me in a very strange way. Don't ask me to explain, it was just a feeling. She showed a keen interest in exactly who I was drinking with when I was out with the boys and where we went. A couple of times, she even showed up at the pub with one of her mates. In hindsight, I should have suspected something. But as her friend Amy, whom she usually brought along, was sweet on one of my pals, I took no notice. I just assumed it was the old matchmaker thing. Then, about 8 months after Sheila's accident, I came out of work one evening to be met by D.C. Collins and a couple of other officers. They asked me to accompany them to the station to help with their inquiries, telling me that if I refused, they would arrest me. At the station, a detective inspector whom I didn't know questioned me about Sheila's accident on the basement stairs. For 4 hours, he went over the events of that evening again and again. After 16 hours of questioning, they suddenly told me I could go home. When I got home, I was totally shocked to find that Sheila had moved out of the house, no note of explanation, nothing. I tried to call her on her mobile phone. We had joined the mobile phone set after our last debacle so we could get in touch with each other wherever we were, but her phone was switched off. The following day, I was standing up the road from her office when Sheila finished work. She came out with one of her colleagues. I began walking towards her to ask what the hell was going on. But as I got closer, Tony Pride appeared and put his arm around her. Now, I could see that Pride had seen me coming, but I'm positive Sheila and her friend had no idea I was there. Sheila made a move to push his arm away, which I noticed, but it didn't register in my mind at the time. I was angry and not really thinking straight. "Sheila, I need to talk to you," I said as I got close enough. "She has nothing to talk to you about," Pride said as he stepped between us. "Get lost. I'm talking to my wife." What happened next was more of a farce than anything else. Pride took up a classic boxer stance and started skipping about like he was a professional or something. I'm warning you, I'm an amateur boxer, he announced. Forget it. I'm really scared. No, Tony, stay out of this. He'll hurt you, Sheila said, apparently in an attempt to get Pride to back off. But Pride wasn't having any of it and moved in close. I assume he was planning on putting me down. He aimed a left jab at my face, probably planning to follow it with a cross, as I noticed his right arm going back. Unfortunately for him, his left fist found my hand waiting for it. Grabbing his fist, I gave it a twist to the left, and he was forced to turn with it. We all heard something snap as I kicked him in the side of his left leg just below the knee, and he collapsed in a heap. You fool! Sheila shouted at me as she knelt beside the not-so-proud Pride who was rolling on the floor in pain. Well, he asked for it. And you just had to be the big man and break his knee. What the hell was I supposed to do? Let him hit me? You shouldn't be here. I don't want to see you anymore, and I certainly don't want to be married to a man who tried to kill me. What the hell are you talking about? I've never done anything to harm you. Oh yeah? Well, I've had therapy, and it's helped me remember what happened the night you threw me down the stairs. The conversation stopped at that point as two police officers grabbed hold of me from behind. I hadn't heard them arrive. They handcuffed me and pushed me into the back of a police van. At the station, I was charged with assault and battery and then shoved into a cell. You might get the idea now why policemen are not my favorite people. Anyway, I called the local criminal solicitor who had represented a few acquaintances of mine in the past. It didn't take him long to get me out. Fortunately for me, security cameras covered the street outside Sheila's office, and they clearly showed what had happened. Foolishly, I didn't press charges for assault against Pride. The video, although it had no sound, definitely showed him attacking me. After that, I tried a couple of times to talk some sense into Sheila, but to no avail. Things really came to a head when a few of the boys and I went to a restaurant for a meal one evening. We'd been there for some time when, who should I spy walking in but Sheila and her best mate Amy, followed by Pride and some other guys. Pride was still limping a little, using a walking stick. They didn't notice us sitting in our corner when they sat down for their meal, Pride sitting opposite Sheila. There was nothing lovey-dovey about the way they behaved towards each other, but I was really upset at seeing them together. The boys managed to keep me under control as we finished our meal rather hurriedly. The plan was for us to leave quietly, but Pride couldn't keep his mouth shut. When he saw me, as loud as he could, he said, "Right now, Sheila, my love, what would you like for dessert?" It was so loud it was obvious that it was meant for my ears. I changed direction so that I would walk past their table. The expression on Pride's face changed from belligerence to a look of apprehension when I got to the table. I stopped in, leaning down so I wouldn't have to speak too loudly myself. I told them, if either of you tries to embarrass me in public again, I'll not be held responsible for my actions. Now, Sheila, if you want to set up home with this guy, apply for a divorce like any civilized person, and don't try to think up lies to get me put in prison. I didn't, Marty. This is not what it looks like. I didn't hear any more as I had walked out of earshot. As we got into the car outside, one of my friends told me that Sheila's friend Amy had followed us out and was standing on the pavement, calling my name. I just told the guy driving to drive on. A few weeks later, my solicitor informed me that he had heard from Sheila's legal people. The divorce went through in a few months. Our lovely house was sold and our assets were divided equally. As there were no children and apparently Sheila was getting married again, there was no alimony to discuss. Well, she didn't ask for any. So that brings us to where we were. Just over a year after the divorce, Sheila was in the hospital again and the police suspected that I was involved in some way. When I got to the hospital, I was surprised to find that Sheila was registered as Mrs. San. I had thought she would have married the guy by now. After I had identified myself to a nurse, she showed me into a room and asked me to wait for the doctor. "Mr. San," the doctor asked as he entered the room. That's me. So sorry. I am confused. There was a man here earlier who said he was Mrs. Sand's fiancé. He could well be. I haven't seen Sheila for over a year now. I'm her ex-husband, but you remember the vows. In sickness and in health, for better or for worse, and all that. Just because we're divorced doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about her. This is a bit unusual, but besides her fiancé, there doesn't appear to be anyone else. No other relatives? That's correct. As far as I'm aware, Sheila has no other relatives. She was orphaned some years ago, before I met her. I'm not sure how we proceed with this one, but it can't do any harm to tell you, and we'll need someone to help us with the release forms. Her fiancé tells us she's a Jehovah's Witness, but really, we need to operate on her the sooner, the better. Her fiancé says she wouldn't agree to invasive surgery, but without it, she's going to die. Jehovah's Witness? What the hell are you talking about? Sheila isn't religious, and she couldn't have changed that much. No, hang on a minute. I know she isn't. I saw a friend of hers the other week, and I'm sure she would have told me if Sheila had suddenly got religion. Give me a minute, and I'll check with Sheila's best friend, Amy. I'm surprised she isn't here anyway. I got out my mobile phone to call Amy. She would know if this Jehovah's Witness thing were true or not. But the doctor stopped me and told me to turn my phone off and use a landline. Then I called Sheila's office. Amy was shocked to hear that Sheila had been in an accident. I asked her why Tony Pride hadn't told everyone at the office about it, and she informed me that Tony didn't work there anymore. When I mentioned the Jehovah's Witness thing, Amy was shocked and said there was no way that was true. I told the doctor, who was still standing there waiting, and he asked me if I could get Amy to the local magistrate's court in a hurry. Then the doctor and I set out for the court ourselves, but in a police car. Amy arrived just as we did. We were ushered into an office where we found Tony Pride and a guy who I took to be a solicitor. They were apparently trying to convince a judge to issue an order that no invasive surgery was to be carried out on Sheila. It was apparent that the judge did not like the idea. Once Amy and I had our say, he gave the doctor authority to do what he thought was in the patient's best interests until she was able to make those decisions for herself. The doctor immediately called the hospital, and Sheila was in surgery by the time we arrived back there. Strangely, when we came out of the courthouse, Tony Pride was nowhere to be found. I was sitting in the waiting room when Doug Collins arrived. I see you never made it to the pub. I guessed you'd still be here, he said. Christ, what's the time? I asked. 7:30, he replied. Bugger. Where's the phone? Amy said as she rushed out of the room, presumably to call someone and postpone a date. How is she? Collins asked. Still in surgery. She's been down there for hours. Damn, I hope she makes it, for your sake. Thanks, Doug. Now, what did you want to talk about? Well, you know what they say about a cop's nose. It was something the old girl said to me this morning. I'm pretty sure someone was trying to set you up for a fall last night. That nosy neighbor of yours spotted a Range Rover just like yours coming into the car park by your flat a couple of times last night. It was in there twice, once about 1:30, and then again about 11:30. The second time it turned up, it only had one headlight working. I get the feeling whoever was driving it was playing dirty. If it happened to pass any video cameras en route to the accident, it would show up at the right time on the right cameras going both ways. I suspect they expected your car to be parked in the car park, and they would have most likely smashed your headlight to match the damage on the Range Rover that hit Sheila. But why? Hang on, I haven't finished. You remember when Sheila fell down the stairs the other year? I came around and had a word with you. Well, we were acting on an anonymous tip-off. I'll give you one guess where that tip-off came from. I must have looked confused. The call box in the foyer of Sheila's office building. We know it was a guy because it was recorded, and guess what time it was made? Just after half a dozen of them had returned from visiting Sheila here. I think she told them she couldn't remember what had happened the day before, and one of them decided to get up to some mischief. Well, since that day, I've had a good idea who, but I haven't been able to figure out the why. Of course, you knocking him about didn't help any. You think Pride said about driving Sheila and me apart? I'm sure he did. What better way to separate a couple than to get her to believe her husband tried to hurt her? Amy returned at this point. Well, I suppose he wanted Sheila divorced and single so he could marry her. He might want to marry Sheila, but she doesn't want to marry him, Amy said with an uncharacteristic tone to her voice. But they're engaged, I said. According to him, but not according to her. She goes out with him socially, but that's all. I don't think they have even kissed each other, let alone anything else. He's asked her to marry him on more than one occasion, but she's got a problem about accepting. He tells everybody that they are engaged, but sometimes Sheila has had a real go at him over it. I don't understand. What's her problem? You lughead. She's in love with you. Talk sense, Amy. Sheila divorced me, remember? Yes, because she likes living. Sheila has been in a real mess for the last year or so, ever since you started playing around with that girl. Sheila knew you wanted to get her out of the way so you could marry the mother of your children. What the hell are you talking about now? I haven't been playing around with anybody, and I certainly haven't got any children out there. Well, that's what she believes because someone put the idea into her head that you've got a girlfriend somewhere, and she's convinced you tried to hurt her. I know she's been very confused that you haven't moved in with the girl. Amy's right, you know, Marty, Doug added. And I think it's Tony Pride who's been putting these ideas into Sheila's head. I'm pretty sure it was Tony Pride who accused you of throwing her down those stairs. It was Tony Pride who attacked you outside the office that night. And it was Tony Pride who claimed it was you driving that Range Rover last night. But what's the guy up to? Assuming that it was him who organized that so-called accident last night, what the hell is his motive for trying to hurt her? Surely it couldn't be because she wouldn't marry him. I know it doesn't make any sense, but that's what we've got to find out. Find the motive, and you've normally got the crime solved. Whatever with all that nonsense about Sheila being a Jehovah's Witness, he certainly showed his hand. It looks to me that he wants Sheila gone for some reason, Doug said. Let's start at the beginning. 1. Someone plants the idea in Sheila's head that you've got a bit on the side. They added some children to make it look like a long-term affair. 2. Someone convinces Sheila that her falling down the stairs when she was drunk wasn't an accident. Oh, by the way, you do know that Sheila didn't have enough alcohol in her blood that night to be done for drunk driving? That's rubbish. She could hardly stand up. Well, that isn't what the blood tests they took here showed. The trouble is they left it too late to find out what else could have been in her blood that night. The doc thought she had taken what he termed a recreational substance, but that could mean anything. What, you think that Pride drugged her? Do you think he was after getting her into bed that night? I asked. No, it wasn't Tony who had those kinds of ideas, Amy interjected. It was some friend of his. Look, we all went to the pub for a drink that night to celebrate one of the other girls' birthdays. Around 7, some of us went up the road to get something to eat. Sheila didn't come with us, she said she was going home when she finished her drink. Anyway, when we got back to the pub around 9, Sheila was out on the floor dancing. Honestly, she was off her head. I'd never seen her dancing like that before. It was like she couldn't stop. Just after 11, the drink seemed to hit her and she virtually collapsed. This Bob, or whoever he was, said he would take her home. Oh yeah, and you can see us letting that happen when Sheila was as drunk as a skunk. The girls and I insisted that she come in her taxi with us. This Bob guy wasn't too pleased about that, but we were adamant. Then Tony stepped in and told him to leave it. Come on, let's make that 3. What would have been your reaction if Sheila had woken up in someone else's bed in the morning, Marty? Don't tell me. I can guess. That plan didn't work, so when our friend finds out Sheila's had an accident and can't remember what happened, he points the finger at you. But Sheila did remember. That therapist she went to, he was a doctor who hypnotized her, and she remembered, Amy exclaimed. Oh yeah, I got the report on those allegations, Doug said. Look, I was in that kitchen the following day. Nothing Sheila said fit correctly. If there had been the fight that Sheila claimed they had, look, there just wasn't room unless half the furniture had been smashed, and it wasn't. And that door to the cellar? It opens outwards. How the hell could Marty have pushed her through it? Remember, there were no marks, no damage, nothing. Plus, the security camera is just outside the back door. The microphone would have picked up any shouting or screaming. All it picked up was Marty shouting a warning to Sheila and her scream as she fell. No, I'm sure Sheila opened the door herself and walked through it, thinking it was the door to the hall. Have you ever heard of planted memories, Amy? Well, that's what I suspect was somehow done to Sheila by that therapist or whoever it was who hypnotized her. Her story was inconsistent with the facts as I know them. Do you have any idea who this therapist was? She went to see someone that Tony knew, I think, Amy replied. You see, Tony pried again. But just what was the man up to? Doug asked, looking at me. Well, I'm stumped if I know. If he wanted to steal my wife, why the hell would he try to hurt her? Maybe we are looking at this wrong. Supposing Tony Pride wanted Sheila gone all the time, Doug suggested. But why would he want to separate her from me first? I asked. That's what we've got to work out, Marty, Doug said, sitting back in his chair, obviously thinking. Amy, who had been looking very thoughtful, suddenly asked, Marty, could Sheila have had any relatives with money? Not that I know of. Why? Look, I'm speculating here, but what if Sheila was going to inherit a lot of money from some relative you didn't know existed, you know, a long-lost aunt or something? Look, this is all a bit Agatha Christie, I know, but I like her books. Now, let's just imagine for a minute that Tony Pride is also related to this unknown benefactor but a little further removed. So, if Sheila dies, he would inherit. Now, if Sheila were to die while she was married to you, even though she didn't know she had inherited the money, it would go to you as her husband. But if you were divorced first, before she inherited, it wouldn't go to you, it would go to the next nearest relative in line. And I'll bet I can guess who that is going to turn out to be. But why the attempted frame on me for the accident last night? Because you can't legally benefit from a crime in this country. Even if you could prove that whoever it was the money is coming from died and left it to Sheila before you were divorced, if you had hurt her, you couldn't inherit the money anyway. We both sat there, looking at Doug. Now, far-fetched, I'll give you, but it certainly fits the scenario. I'm going back to the station to see what I can dig up on our Mr. Anthony Pride. And while I'm at it, Marty, give me Sheila's maiden name. Do you know where she was born? Smith. Her maiden name was Sheila Smith, but I haven't got the faintest idea where she was born. She's never been very forthcoming about her childhood. All I can really tell you is that she's an orphan. But her birth certificate must be somewhere. I'll need to find it if I can. I think there must be a copy in the files at home. I don't remember her taking it with her. I'll have a look and dig it out later. Right. If you don't hear from me first, call me on my mobile. Here's the number, Doug said as he gave me a card and then left the room. Amy and I sat alone together for another hour before one of the doctors came in to see us. The operation was over. Sheila had a fractured skull and there had been a lot of bleeding into her brain. We gathered they had had some difficulty stopping the bleeding. I wouldn't say the doctor was pessimistic, but he was annoyed that Tony Pride had delayed the operation with all the nonsense about Sheila being a Jehovah's Witness. With the way litigation goes nowadays, they needed to get the permission of a judge before they could proceed. Once they had it, he said the prognosis was fair, but not good. They would keep Sheila sedated for the next few days while they waited for some of the swelling in her brain to go down. Amy and I went in to see her, but all we could see were bandages and tubes everywhere, like those machines beeping away on TV. The doctors told us Sheila had numerous broken bones, but it was the injuries to her head that they were most concerned about. Amy and I left the hospital together and went for a meal at a nearby fish and chip shop. I dropped Amy off at home and she asked me to pick her up and take her back to the hospital in the morning. She had no intention of returning to work until she knew Sheila was all right. At home, I searched our files for Sheila's birth certificate but couldn't find it. Then it struck me, none of our papers were there. No marriage license or deed, and Sheila's old passport was gone. I'd given her current one to her solicitor when he asked for it, but I was sure he hadn't asked for her other papers. Yes, I had been playing silly games during the divorce. If Sheila didn't ask, she didn't get. When you're playing a losing hand, any small victory makes you feel a little bit better. I didn't sleep well that night. I don't think I slept at all. Amy and I were back at the hospital at 8 o'clock, but there was no change in Sheila's condition. Tony Pride hadn't shown up again either. I rang my office and told them I wouldn't be in for some time. They didn't object, which is the advantage of being good at your job. They didn't want to lose me. Doug Collins turned up again around 1:30. I noticed Detective Sergeant Moon came with him this time, but he stayed well away from me, except when he came over to ask how Sheila was. He'd already spoken to the doctor, so I think he was trying to build a bridge. Doug said they couldn't find Tony Pride, well, not the Tony Pride that we all knew. Whoever he was, he had stolen someone else's identity. The real Tony Pride, according to the paperwork, was living in Australia. The address he had been using was for a rented room in a house. Apparently, they only ever saw him about once a week when he collected his mail. Everything that was known about him was false. 2 weeks passed with Amy and I sitting by Sheila's bed all day, every day. Then, one morning, Doug Collins came in and told us he'd managed to trace Sheila's now-deceased great-uncle. Apparently, the man had several £1,000,000 that Sheila would inherit. It turned out she had been orphaned much younger than I had thought. She had been adopted, and her new parents had changed her surname. Doug had been to see them, and they told him she had not taken the news of her adoption very well. A rift had formed between them, and she had effectively run away. They hadn't seen or heard from her since she was 18. They turned up at the hospital one day, but they didn't stay long. It must have been upsetting for them to see her in that condition. I told them I would let them know when she regained consciousness. They thanked me and said they would return then. One of the nurses told me they called 3 times a day after that for progress reports. Weeks after the accident, things had changed a little. Some of the bandages had been removed, but we still sat there, listening to the monotonous beep of the heart monitor. One of the machines that were recording Sheila's brain activity had been showing signs that made the medical staff optimistic, but they meant little to us. Amy and I had both returned to work by then. We had a rotation going. I sat with Sheila one day, Amy the next, and one of the other girls from Sheila's office took the third day. Then it was my turn again. Both Amy and I visited every evening and ate together afterward. We had our own table at the fish and chip shop by then, and a sign had appeared on the wall saying, "No change." Other customers and the staff had overheard Amy and my conversations and had become involved in Sheila's plight. We did all we were supposed to do, played music that Sheila liked, talked to her about everything and anything. I discovered Doug Collins was calling after he finished the late shift to read Wuthering Heights to her, Sheila's favorite book. He'd spotted her well-thumbed copy on her bedside table when he was searching her flat for her documents. We never did discover when the papers were taken from my flat or by whom, but we never found any of them. One morning, I thought I was talking to Sheila, but I must have been more tired than I realized. Suddenly, I heard a croaky voice quietly say, "Hello, Marty. Are you awake?" I'm not quite sure what I did then. I know that the table beside me, with a cup and saucer on it, went flying and the noise brought the nurses running. I must have said something to Sheila, but I have no idea what. The next thing I remember is being ushered out of the room when the doctors arrived. Then, I started making phone calls, which led to people arriving in droves. However, they were not allowed into Sheila's room. After some time, a nurse called Amy and me out of the waiting room where everyone had congregated. She told us we could go see Sheila again. When we reached the door, I stopped and let Amy go first. She walked over to the bed, and I saw Sheila smile at her. They started talking to each other. I took that as my cue to leave. I had done my duty, staying with Sheila while she was at death's door. Now, with my duty done, it was time to get on with my life. I stopped by the fish and chip shop to give them the news and watched as they put up a sign saying, "She's awake." Then, I went home to pack. The last month or so had been a strain on me, Christ, the last few years had been a bloody strain. I wanted to be somewhere else for a while. My boss wasn't too impressed when I told him I was off to Spain for a couple of weeks, but he didn't argue. I had been at my friend's villa for a week when Amy showed up. Curious as to why she was there, I watched her get out of the taxi. The way she walked up to the swimming pool where I was sitting let me know she was not in a good mood. "Just what the hell do you think you're playing at, Martin?" she demanded when she got close enough for me to hear. "What's your problem? Aren't I allowed to take a holiday?" "No, not when your wife needs you, you aren't." "Hang on, Amy, you're forgetting Sheila isn't my wife anymore. She divorced me, remember? She decided she didn't need me anymore." "Well, why did you sit beside her bed for 5 weeks while she was unconscious, then?" "Duty, nothing more. And sickness and health, until death do us part, and all that." "Don't give me that crap, you love her." "Immaterial, Amy. Sheila divorced me. What I feel for her is unimportant." "Marty, she loves you." "I don't believe that for 1 minute. Remember what she did to me? That wasn't love. No, it was a mixed-up girl who needed help. Well, she chose someone else to give her that help. Now she's rich enough, she'll have plenty of guys willing to help her. Don't you worry. That's the point, I am worried. Look, she loves you and needs you." "What? For her to shout at? To call me a murderer? Or to knock her boyfriends around when they get upset and give her an excuse to call me a fool? Christ, you are upset with Sheila, aren't you?" "I am. I love her, but the year we were apart, up until she had that accident, I think I was happier than I'd been in the previous 6 years. I can't say I was happy to be without her, but I wasn't walking on eggshells every day because I didn't know what kind of mood she was going to get out of bed in. But Marty, Sheila was suffering from, oh yeah, PMS or whatever you want to call it. But remember, she accused me of trying to harm her. I don't need all that in my life. No, it wasn't PMS. Oh, the psychiatrists think that the hormone thing made it worse, but they are sure Sheila has probably been suffering from clinical depression ever since little Kathy died. And you know Sheila's memory of you trying to hurt her was implanted while she was hypnotized." "Nonsense, Amy. PMS or clinical depression, what the hell am I supposed to be, a psychiatric nurse or something? And I'll never believe you can make anyone do something they don't really want to do by hypnotizing them." But Sheila recalls that evening in detail now. She says it was like watching what was happening without having any control over it. She remembers swearing at you and even knew she was opening the wrong door. She says she just couldn't stop what was happening. I don't give a damn anymore. Look, I did my bit. I was there when she needed me. Now I'm going to live my own life and forget about Sheila. Oh, I've wasted my time coming here then. You sure have. Amy never said goodbye. She just turned around and walked slowly back to her taxi. She stopped and looked back at me one more time before getting in, then it drove away. I had been back from my holiday for a couple of weeks when Doug Collins called around on a Saturday morning. He found me in the throes of packing up everything as I was moving to a small house on the other side of town. He told me they hadn't been able to track down the alias Tony Pride. They were pretty sure they knew who he was. Apparently, they believed he was a great-nephew of Sheila's benefactor. But as he was illegitimate, that had put him out of the running for the money unless there were no other living relatives. Doug asked me why I hadn't gone to see Sheila since I'd been back. And, well, we had the same kind of argument that I'd had with Amy. I won't go into that one. About 6 months later, my solicitor asked me to call on him. He presented me with a check for nearly £5 million. Apparently, it was my half of Sheila's inheritance. We had mutually agreed to split our assets down the middle when we divorced. Since her great-uncle had actually died before we were divorced, Sheila had sent half the money on to me. With due ceremony, I tore the check into pieces and asked my solicitor to send it back. We went through that same pantomime at least 5 times before the check stopped arriving. The next thing that hit me was the Inland Revenue. They sent me a demand for tax on the £5 million. It took a lot of persuading to convince them that I had not accepted the money. One of the tax inspectors actually said to me, "Are you nuts?" "I was when I married her, but I'm not anymore," I replied. I think he was the one who finally accepted the fact that I was not going to take the money. During the next year, I changed my job. I was headhunted by another company, where I made a fresh start and started dating some of the girls in the office, nothing serious. Once bitten, twice shy, and all that. One of the girls I went out with was a member of the local country club, and she introduced me to golf. It was more exercise than I'd had in years. I wasn't much good at it, but I enjoyed playing, so I joined the country club myself. Generally, I tended to play on my own. Not being very good, I wouldn't show myself up too much that way. There are 3 courses, so by making an early start in the summer, I was usually on my own on the course most of the time, with no one chasing up behind me. One morning, by the 5th green, I was hunting for at least one of the balls I'd managed to knock into the woods. After looking around for a while and locating 2 balls that weren't mine, I was just coming out of the small thicket, but on the wrong side, over by the 6th tee, when someone on the 6th must have sliced a ball that made a hole in one right on my nose. I was stunned for a couple of minutes and found myself sitting on the ground, nursing my nose, when the culprit came over, apologizing profusely. "Hasn't anyone ever told you to shout for before you tee off?" I demanded in anger. I couldn't see a thing as both my eyes were watering so much. "I'm sorry, Marty. I didn't realize you were so close." I knew that voice, but for a minute, I couldn't or didn't want to place it. "Who are you?" "I can't see," I demanded. "Don't you know?" the voice asked. I did know, but I didn't want to. "I can't see." "Point me in the direction of the clubhouse," I said as I got to my feet. "What about your stuff?" "I'll walk back with you and carry your clubs for you." "No, don't bother. I'll get one of the caddies to collect them for me." "Marty, I can't let you go off like this." "I'm coming with you." "No, leave me alone. Haven't you messed up my life enough?" "Marty, I never meant to treat you so badly. I didn't realize how badly I'd behaved towards you until Amy told me when she came back from Spain." "That's over now, Sheila. Just stay out of my life in the future, will you?" "No, I'm not going to do that, Marty. I love you, and I believe you love me." "Well, you might not love me at this particular minute, as I've just hit you with a golf ball, but I know I can make you love me again." "Ha! I had planned that you would catch me up out here. I'm sorry I hit you. What's it going to take, woman, to convince you to stay away from me?" "Well, I'd suggest you start by trying to get a court order, but as I've got enough cash to fight you on that all the way to the European court, I think you'll be wasting your time on that one. Look, the sensible thing is for me to take you to the clubhouse and then to the hospital if need be. We can talk about everything else later." Well, I'm having that damn dream again. There she is, like always, bouncing up and down on me. But hang on, what's that noise? The babies are crying. Don't worry about that. The nanny will see to them. That's what she's paid for, Sheila said, smiling down at me. Life goes on. Life goes on.